again, because people are still coming in, that when you do register for the different learning bursts, when you do register for the Learning Burst through Eventbrite, please be mindful that Eventbrite sends you a link, and that link is going to be for the entire series. This is our 4th and final in this series, but you would register for our next series coming up, and they will send you the Zoom link and a calendar invite. So please mark your calendars with that, so you will have this link, okay? And it's the same link throughout. So without further ado, I will turn everything over to Eli Synder today to talk to us about some working good container gardening.
Okay, thanks, Sharonda. Hey, everyone. It's good to see everybody again. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation, and we'll jump in and talk about container gardening. As Sharonda mentioned, I'm an extension agent, and I work in Wilkes County in the western part of the state. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
We cannot.
No, we cannot.
Okay, I'm sorry. Hold on one sec. Didn't share it yet.
All right, we see your screen now.
Great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be talking about container gardening of edibles. Of course, there are many things that we can grow in containers. Succulents are really popular right now, and different flowers certainly, but I'm focusing today on edibles. So we'll talk some about a few different edible things you can grow, and also talk about why we grow in containers. So first of all, let's talk about this. Why do we grow in containers? Growing containers can allow us to grow food in small spaces. Can also be a great way for people who are physically limited to produce their own food. Containers you can put up on ledges or easier to reach spaces, and make gardening kind of more accessible for people who may have a physical handicap or lesser ability, and they can also produce their own food. Some people may not have access to a garden space, or they may live in an apartment and only have patio area in which they can garden, or they may rent a home and or living space, and they don't want to or can't install any kind of permanent garden where they are. So those are all advantages to consider of container gardening. It's a very accessible type of gardening for those who may be facing a situation where they can't garden in the soil. One neat thing about container gardening is that it also can allow you to have some season extension. So containers you can move. So you can have them outside when it's appropriate for the particular plant, or you can move them inside when it gets too cold for that plant. So it actually provides you a little bit of season extension flexibility. With containers, we're using a soil that's not from our native ground, or it's not our native soils. And in some instances, this allows us to avoid soil-borne diseases or soil-borne problems such as root knot nematodes. Those are very common across the state in different soils. And if you happen to have a place to garden that's full of those, then gardening in containers provides you an opportunity to do so successfully while avoiding that problematic soil. So there's a number of advantages and reasons why you might want to consider gardening in containers. Some other considerations to think about, though, when you're choosing whether you're going to garden in containers. Perhaps you have a deer problem, or again, you'd like to extend your growing season. Growing in containers may allow you an inherent level of protection from certain pests such as deer or squirrels if they can't access where you have your containers, and protect your plants that way, or maybe even rabbits. Again, it allows you the opportunity to bring them to a protected area if there is a significant weather event like frost that may damage the plants that you're growing. So that's another advantage. But there's some considerations. They do require frequent watering, and perhaps more frequent watering than's normal for in the ground garden spot. Sometimes they require more frequent fertilization depending on what you're growing. And then they don't use native soil. So that's actually an added expense that often is part of container gardening that you wouldn't necessarily face if you're growing in an in-ground environment. So what can we grow in containers? And specifically, again, I'm talking today about edibles. Many of our common vegetables are well suited to containers. So from everything from lettuce and onions to tomatoes, even potatoes or sweet potatoes, we can grow most of the vegetables that many of us enjoy eating in containers. There's a couple of fruits that do particularly well in containers. Strawberries or blueberries are the two I'm going to talk about today. Of course, flowers, there's many endless numbers of non-edible flowers that grow well in containers, even shrubs and things like that. But there are a number of edible flowers as well that do well. Things like nasturtium, it's a popular salad garnish and it has a nice spicy flavor. It grows very well in containers. Herbs are also a popular favorite for growing containers. We've got the annual herbs like basil, cilantro, dill, parsley, and that grow well in containers, as well as the perennial herbs, things like thyme, oregano, rosemary, lavender. One neat thing about growing these kind of perennial herbs is they tend to be spreading in habit, and especially these herbs listed here, they don't mind being dry for a period of time. So knowing that we have to keep on top of watering and water more frequently, these herbs in particular are pretty resilient in containers because if you let them dry out a little bit, they don't mind it so much. All right, so we'll get back to what you can grow and specifics on those later, but first we'll talk about container materials and the media and watering and light needs. So containers need to be able to hold the soil media that you're growing in. So plants do require that media that helps them anchor to their space and helps them develop a root system, which helps them take up water and nutrients. So a container has to hold that media there. And it also has to be able to drain water. So if, there's many different types of containers you can use. And if you want to use something as a container that doesn't already have drainage holes in it, you can always put those holes in yourself. But basically, there's a number of different materials to choose from. And some of these may be more or less common to you, but of course, keep your mind open when you think about container materials. So many of you have likely seen these clay or terracotta pots. These are very attractive and very popular. They're what's considered a porous material, so they do actually take in some water themselves. So they may need extra attention to that watering and soil more moisture. But they're very attractive. Some of them are more and less tolerant to being in the sunshine. It's another factor to consider, depending on where you're going to place those. Excuse me. There are semi-porous materials, wood or pressed fibers. So these inherently have some ability to drain water through themselves. And again, they're going to hold a little bit water a little bit better than those porous materials. They can also be very attractive, but could be as simple as using a next leftover barrel that you make into a container for growing things. If you have some materials laying around, know that you can use that for growing in as well. And then there's the non-porous materials, things like plastic, metal, fiberglass, glazed ceramic. They don't absorb any water, so generally will hold water a little bit better than these other two types. And again, have a different tolerance to UV exposure. So keep that in mind if you're going to be placing yours in a sunny spot and it's very sensitive to degradation with light exposure, then it may not last as long as a different type of material. Some other things to think about with the containers that you select is the heat absorption of that particular container. Knowing that dark colors absorb more heat, that can be a good thing if you want to have your container be a particular warm spot. If you want to grow lettuce quickly in the spring, having a dark container can help keep that soil warmer and get you a crop faster. Um, Conversely, you may choose a lighter color to reflect that heat and keep things a little bit cooler, say if you wanted to grow lettuce in the summertime. Metals conduct heat better, so they can get, they're maybe a little bit more resilient in a heat condition. I'll tell you that some concrete and ceramic materials will absorb heat and hold that heat and stay very hot for a long time. I've grown potatoes in a concrete bin at a community garden I worked with, and boy, they would just fry up because that got so hot. Consider the weight of the container and how large it will, how heavy it'll be with when it's filled with media and plants. Maybe you want a heavier container because you're growing in a really windy site, and having that heavy container helps keep the container in place when you're not there. Or are you going to need to move it? If you are going to move it in and out of your house due to weather or protecting something from frost, then definitely consider whether or not you're going to be able to move it with tools that you have based on the weight that it is. So, if you're going to need to move something a lot, consider a lighter material or a mobile type of container, maybe one with handles to make it easy to move. We talked about the ability to withstand sunlight and UV. That's important to consider. And then one thing that didn't show up there was, of course, the decorative value. Sometimes we want things to look better than others. Other times we are just growing basically a farm-in container. So you may not worry about how the container looks as much, say, compared to something that's right around your front door or a hanging basket out front of your home that you want to be visually appealing as well. Container size is really important. So you want to be sure to select the right size container for different crops. And this is a chart of different vegetable crops and recommended container sizes for each of them. Keep in mind, so this gives like a recommended minimum container size per plant, and then some spacing for the plant, and as well as the minimum container depth. So depending on the type of crop it is, you may need a different amount of space for the root system. That's really important to consider. So definitely pay attention to that. And I will share a PDF of these slides at the end so you have an ability to access this chart. This is also in the NC State Extension Gardener Handbook, and so you could find the information there. All of that information is available online and it is free. So generally for the shallow rooted vegetable crops, you're looking at a container that needs to be 4 to 8 inches deep. For root or fruit crops, you're definitely looking to the 10 to 12 inch depth. Keep in mind that a larger container is going to have better moisture retention because there's more soil in there that's holding onto that moisture. And so if it's a situation where you can't water it for a few days, and just know that that's how your life is, and you just not going to get to watering it all the time, then, or every day, then choose a larger container to provide some extra moisture. So when we fill these containers, we don't use soil from a garden, but we do need to kind of emulate that in the type of media that we fill our containers with. So we need to make sure there's good drainage, because poor drainage is not good for plant roots. There can be a lack of oxygen and some pathogens, and especially if you're just using topsoil or garden soil and putting those in containers, these two problems can be very bad. So instead we use what are called soil-less substrates, or also referred to as potting mix or media. These are a little bit lighter material. They don't generally have pathogens. That's the idea. When you buy a commercial mix for these for growing containers, it should not have any pathogens in it. Again, better aeration, so and better water holding capacity as well because of the materials that they're made of. And all these things make a better environment for healthy plant roots when they're in containers. So just quickly going through some common media components, and I'm doing this because you may choose to make your own media, and there are some commercial pre-mixed media available as well. So one of the kind of backbones of media for container gardening is some kind of organic material like aged pine bark, peat moss, or coconut coir. And really this makes usually at least 40% of most media blends that you come across. These are important for water retention. They do hold a lot of water and they create this very porous space as the basis of the media. You can buy them in mixes, or you can buy them in bulk or just in solid bales or bags on their own. Peat moss and aged pine bark are very common. Coconut coir is becoming more widely available, and it is actually a neat product. It's sort of a byproduct of the coconut processing. So it's a sort of a recycled material. Peat moss is harvested from bogs and sometimes not in the most sustainable fashion. And so that industry has gotten some criticism for that over the years. Aged pine bark, that's a byproduct of the timber and milling industry. And we have generally a pretty good supply of that in North Carolina because we do have a lot of mills that are processing pine. We've got a lot of pine plantations. So it can be pretty widely available and inexpensive, especially if you're in the eastern part of the state. A lot of people like to put compost into media, and so compost is decomposed plant materials that have been broken down to a semi stable state. Generally has good water and nutrient holding capacities. The quality of your compost is going to depend on the source material. So has it been composted well, undergone the proper heating processes in order to kill pathogens? Sometimes in a homemade compost situation, we're not able to get the perfect ratio or the ideal temperature requirements to make sterile compost. And to me, that is the biggest risk of using compost that is not commercially produced in a media. Especially when plants are small, they're susceptible to pathogens that may be in the soil. And so I generally, if people are interested in using compost, I recommend using a commercially made material to help make sure that this is a sterile or less pathogenic product to put into your container media. I also don't recommend using more than 10 to 20%. Compost does have some nutrient value in it, and putting a higher amount of compost in, depending on that particular compost, could damage plants. Again, just depending on the specific plant and the compost material. But usually 10 to 20% would be a good amount to mix in. And if anyone's interested in more resources on composting and how to do so properly, there's excellent information on the NC State website that I link here. Perlite and vermiculite, these are very common components of media, and I'd recommend if you're making your own, definitely consider incorporating both of them or at least one of them. But the difference is perlite improves drainage and aeration, but it doesn't hold water or nutrients. Whereas vermiculite, it'll improve water and nutrient retention in the soil. So they're both very commonly mixed in for slightly different purposes, but very valuable components of most media. Sometimes sand is utilized. This can improve the drainage. So if you have a very heavy mixture, sand's mixed in. typically at a rate of less than 10% of the overall media. This is important for plants that really need good drainage. Succulents are one example. A lot of those pre-mixed succulent soil mixes do contain a fair amount of sand in them. Here are just some media recipes. I won't go through every one, but if you want to make your own, these will be available in the PDF that gets sent out afterwards. But as you can see, they're generally a mix of some kind of peat or pine bark, one of those organic materials, plus different ratios of vermiculite and perlite and or sand or compost. Of course, there's commercial container media available. Again, easy to find and purchase. They're available at pretty much any garden center, box stores. You want to look for something that is described as potting mix or a media, and avoid those things that are called topsoil, potting soil, or garden soil. Those are made from actual garden soil. Again, not going to be sterile, going to be a heavier material that's not really appropriate for containers. Any of these mixes or media that you get may contain fertilizers, and for plants that you're going to be growing for a long time, getting something with some pre-mixed fertilizer in there is a good idea, especially any kind of fruiting crop that's going to be grown. Generally, getting something with a pre-mixed fertilizer is helpful. So tips for adding the media to your pots. You want to moisten it before you plant into it, especially peat moss. Peat moss, and you don't want to let it dry out. So peat moss is very hydrophobic when it gets dry, so it can be difficult to re-wet. But you want to have a nice moisture level. Don't want it to be sopping wet, but good and moist before you plant into it. When you fill your container, you want to kind of leave a couple inches at the top, 1 to 3 inches as a reservoir for watering. When you plant into it, you sort of want to maintain the crown line of the plant with the substrate line. So keep those right in line with each other when you go to actually plant. You don't want to pack your media in. So once you've filled your container, you can just gently shake it up and down or knock it on a table and let that media settle, but you don't want to pack it down into the container. Some people insist on and like to add gravel to pots. This doesn't actually improve the drainage. And sometimes it can create a perched water table. So for really deep-rooted plants that want to send their roots down as far as possible to scavenge nutrients and water, this will actually limit the amount of space that the roots have to grow in. So I don't really recommend this. Except in certain plants that will require it, which generally is not any of our food crops. One thing I do recommend is that, especially if you are moving these plants in and out, or just if they're on your patio and you don't want it to be covered in media, I recommend placing a piece of newspaper or mesh at the base of the container before you fill it with media to kind of hold that media in. So something that's porous that lets water drain out still, but will hold the media in. So plants need, in addition to that media, nutrients. So nutrients are essential for the plant to grow well and develop the edible part that we want. And those nutrients are absorbed through the roots, and water is as well. And so it's actually nutrients are absorbed and dissolved in the water, and that's how plants take them up when they're taking up water. So it's important to think about fertilizing your plants, and this kind of the elements listed here on the left, the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, those are essential plant elements that they get from the atmosphere. And then the macro and micronutrients in this blue square are obtained from the soil. So plants need to get all of these essential nutrients in order to fulfill their biochemical processes and grow as we want them to. So fertilizer is the way we supply these nutrients to plants. And we'll talk a little bit about the different types of fertilizer that you might use. So in containers, again, many of the mixes will contain some pre-mixed media. So a lot of them will contain a slow release fertilizer. And if they don't, you can add some other products that would act like a slow release fertilizer. If anyone has heard of Osmocote, that jar that's right there in the center, that is a slow release fertilizer. It's coated in a material that makes it release steadily instead of all at once. You can also use different composted manures or things like blood meal, mix those into the soil ahead of planting to provide some source of fertilizer that's already pre-mixed into the soil. And then in containers, we often find ourselves adding some kind of fertilizer throughout the growing period. These are often in the liquid form, and you kind of apply them regularly as needed throughout plant growth, depending on the plant's preferences. The key thing with these is you really want to pay attention to the recommended rate. It's quite easy to burn plant roots with these materials, as they're they have a high salt content, and they're highly concentrated. And so it's important to read all the directions on a particular material that you're feeding, and try to make sure you're mixing at the right ratios with water as you feed the plants. So I'm getting a little behind, but there are synthetic and organic types of fertilizer. And if anyone has questions on this, maybe it's appropriate to talk about this later. But there are both synthetic and organic types of both of the types of fertilizers I mentioned, the pre-mixed products that you would mix into the soil before planting, as well as the liquid feed products that you would feed after the plants have been growing for a while. And so for the organic examples, if that's a personal preference of yours, then you would look for products that have this symbol at the bottom, or OMRI listed. That stands for Organic Materials Review Institute. That's the board that certifies a certain product as organic. And so look for that symbol on any product if organic gardening is your personal preference. And here are some examples of the organic products you might be feeding. Fish emulsion and liquid kelp are really common liquid products that you would feed afterwards. And then for materials you'd incorporate before planting, you could use compost or compost and manure, things like green sand, bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, kelp meal, Epsom salts. There's a whole different variety of fertilizers depending on the particular plant needs. And with the synthetic types of fertilizer, there are many different liquid fertilizers like Miracle-Gro plant foods, granular fertilizers. You can use really anything that you use out in the field, just keeping in mind that you want to make sure not to over apply any of these fertilizers to the container. All right, so watering. Emphasize that watering is super important. When do you water? Basically when you need to. When the top few inches of your media are dry, it's generally time to water. You don't want to overwater because this can lead to diseases. When you do water, you want to water until the water comes out of the container. If you're in a situation where you can't water as much as you'd like and you see this wilting happening on a regular basis, you might consider using mulch in your container, just as we do in a field grow garden. You want to put a mulch down made out of straw or newspaper. You usually want to put that about 1 to 2 inches thick and keep that about 1 inch away from the plants. Sometimes in containers, we grow things in a very crowded situation, and so mulch isn't as practical. Straw mulch can be a good option if that's the case for you. But just know that, just because you're growing in containers, you don't have to keep away from mulch. It can be used to help keep moisture in. Things to think about with your watering frequency. When you have higher light and higher temperature conditions, you're gonna need to increase your watering, generally speaking. Humidity may play a role. Sometimes we don't need to water as much if it's very humid out, or it may influence how you water depending on the humidity conditions. Container size, so larger containers again, sometimes need to be watered less frequently. But again, you want to think about your plant water use as well. And sometimes our heavy drinkers are also in our larger containers. So tomato, just because it's in a big container, doesn't mean it doesn't need to be watered frequently. It still does because it uses quite a bit of water. And then your media. No, that's something you'll understand as you try out different media types. Some are going to hold water better than others. And so some are just going to need to be watered more frequently than others. So to watering methods, you can water with a watering can. Of course, this is cheap and easy. It's easy. You can carry it different places, but it can be heavy to carry. I don't like watering cans as much because they can deliver water at sort of an uneven rate, and it can make soil splash. It's not my favorite. Garden hoses, of course, are common. They can be, heavy to haul around, but sometimes lighter than or easier to carry than a watering can. They can wet foliage, of course, but I recommend trying to avoid that whenever possible because we can have a high incidence of disease where we are in this part of the country. I like to use hose ends that allow for different types of watering patterns, and that really helps with the water flow. So you get an even pattern and rate delivered to your plants. Drip irrigation, if you have an extensive container planting, this might be something for you. It lowers the volume of water, reduces the runoff that we're applying, doesn't with the foliage. It's very easy. You just turn on a hose end. You can attach this drip irrigation system to your spigot and turn on the spigot and let that system do the watering for you. But it does require some expense to install, and it may require some regular maintenance as well. Generally, you have to drain the system and put it away for the winter time to keep water from freezing inside of it. So light is another thing to think about. We can grow a lot of fruits and vegetables, but depending on our light situation, we're going to have a harder or easier time with it. Generally, for our fruiting crops, we're going to want 8 to 10 hours of sunlight per day. And for our leafy crops, stem crops and roots, we're looking at more like 6 to 8 hours. So depending on your light situation, you can sort of understand what's going to go best where you are and what you have to work with. So I think I went over this last time, but we've got a few different planting seasons. We've got cool season crops that we can grow in late winter, early spring, as well as in the fall into early winter. And then we've got our warm season crops that we grow in the summertime during our frost-free period. Those are cold sensitive crops. And so it's important to know where you are in the state and where your average frost-free dates fall. And keep in mind to always watch the weather around when those dates are coming to know when to plant out your warm season crops or take them in at the end of the season. So again, I don't want to say the sky's the limit for the vegetables that we can grow in containers, but we really do have a wide ability to grow different crops. So we can grow greens, things like lettuces, Swiss chard, kale, cauliflower, and then there's some heading crops like cauliflower and broccoli. And keep in mind, different plants will have different space requirements. So broccoli is going to grow really one plant per 1 gallon container. It requires a lot of nutrition and a lot of space to form properly. Whereas in a 1 gallon container, you can grow a lot of little heads of lettuce, or you can have a regular cut and come again section of lettuce where you're harvesting half of it one week and the other half the second week and letting it grow back. And so when you're thinking about what to plant in containers, just think about, what you eat often, what's going to give you the most bang for your buck. Containers are themselves small spaces to grow in. So, I encourage people to prioritize what they really like to eat and grow and select accordingly. You can grow onions, of course, in containers. They do well. Peas grow very well in a trellised container. Of course, we can do some root crops like carrots and and beets. Keep in mind that with root crops in containers, excuse me, you're going to need to disturb the soil quite a bit when you're harvesting them. So sometimes people plant mixed containers, and sometimes these root crops, when you're harvesting them in a mixed container, will disturb the roots of others. So there may be a better option for growing sort of in a relay setting, or one where they're the only crop growing in a container. Our warm season vegetables like tomatoes, squash, eggplant, peppers, cucumbers, all these favorites can do really well in containers. Again, the advantage of growing them in containers is you can bring them inside when there might be a frost event, or at the end of the season, you can actually extend the season by having them in containers and bringing them inside and harvesting for a couple more weeks after we've had a frost event. So with these warm season crops, especially because a lot of them are pretty big and vining and they produce fruit, you want to look for some of the container or compact or dwarfing varieties. That is really important. So going back to this picture of tomatoes here, this is a compact container designed variety, and it's excellent, but it's just designed to be smaller. It doesn't even need to be trellised like regular tall tomato vines do. So look for those dwarfing varieties, and there are a bunch out there, especially for tomatoes and for eggplant and basil. Now squash, this is a picture of a patty pan type squash, and summer squash like zucchini and crookneck and patty pan, those are usually growing in a bush type squash plant. So they don't produce long runners like a pumpkin plant does, and so they're well suited for growing in containers. Now, if you wanted to try to grow some kind of pumpkin or winter squash in a container, there are some bush varieties out there, and I would recommend trying those. So this is a picture of a bush butternut. There's a bush delicata squash now, and a bush buttercup that I've seen on the market. So there are a few options out there, and more coming out all the time for growing winter squash in containers. Similarly with melons, there aren't as many of those available, but keep in mind with melons, they do produce a very heavy fruit. And so either you need to leave space for them to vine off the side of the container and onto the ground or a protected surface, or if you construct a trellis with them, you may need to support them as they the individual fruit as they start to form. So I've seen people use pantyhose to kind of wrap the fruit as they grow and attach them to the trellis just as an extra support, just because that fruit can be very heavy and pull over the vine or even break off if it's left to grow. Keep in mind that these squash and tomatoes and cucumbers, they do need a good bit of support, and they also need a good bit of water to produce the fruit that you want. Again, advantage of container gardening is you get that season extension. So who doesn't love fresh basil? Dried basil just doesn't do the same thing. And so growing basil in containers is an awesome way to keep fresh basil during your growing season and then beyond into the winter when you bring it inside. I recommend looking for some of these dwarf types. If you can't find dwarf types of basil, that's okay, because basil, as long as you kind of train it by regularly plucking the tops of the basil, then the basil will continue to branch and become more like a bush shape that's in these pictures here. These are dwarf types or container types, but even a regular sized basil plant will become more bushy as long as you train it back by continually harvesting those kind of the top layer of leaves and using that throughout the season. They'll continue to bush and branch. Peppers will often go for a lot longer if you let them and maintain them through the season. You know, if they keep them healthy throughout the season by regular watering and fertilizer and disease prevention, they will produce for a long period of time. I mean, they, in a different climate, they would live for years. They would be perennial. My mother-in-law lives on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and I remember a few times she's had poblano peppers growing for 3 or 4 years until they get a really cold winter. So again, these can be more like a perennial if they're grown in a container and maintained properly. So I've mentioned keeping on top of watering with these fruiting crops. One big problem that we have in this part of the country is dew at nighttime. So we get cool nights during some parts of the year, and then we have hot, humid days, and sometimes we get long periods of dew overnight, and this can lead to diseases that shorten the life of your plants growing in the summertime. And one way that you can protect against this in containers is to kind of move these plants under cover or to a warmer area at night. And this actually allows you to kind of protect them a little bit more against disease. Some suggestions for that, if you are going to be moving them, you could use a handled containers or place containers on carts to move them as needed. So have a cart available that can move in and out of a space where you're bringing them at night. And make sure, you know, that there's space for these tall vining crops to sit on those containers. This really can help make it easier to move them, make it less of a chore if they can sit on those carts, and help you protect the plants as well. And yeah, so trellises are really important for vining or large fruited crops. This kind of grid trellis that's photographed here is a good option. You can also use tomato cages. Those would be appropriate for eggplant, pepper, tomatoes, or even cucumbers, or even peas or beans. A lot of people will grow those on support system like cages in containers. All right, so mixed containers are really popular. And that, by mixed, I mean planting different species of plants together in a container. There's a few keys to success, and there's an excellent description of that in one of the links that I have placed later in the presentation. And I can also send that directly to be sent out. But there is an excellent publication on different mixes that are recommended for container vegetable gardening. But there's some key features to those mixes. And one of those is to match plants with similar light, nutrient, and moisture requirements. In other words, don't mix those dry loving plants with moisture loving plants. So the dry loving herbs like rosemary and oregano, you don't want to mix them with other annual herbs that like more moisture like cilantro or parsley. Instead, you want to keep your dry plants with each other and keep your moisture loving plants with each other. Similarly, you want to think about the light and the nutrient needs of different plants. So match those as best as possible when you make your mixes. When you select a container for a mixed planting, you want to make sure the container is large enough for all of those plants to grow. In other words, not just a 1 gallon pot for one thing of broccoli. If you're going to put some lettuce around it, you want to select a larger container that can handle all those lettuce plants as well. There's something called relay planting or intercropping. One example of this could be growing lettuce and tomato. And the idea with this is lettuce is a cool season crop. And you're starting the lettuce, you plant the lettuce earlier than you do your tomato. Allow that to grow for a while. and perhaps it's not ready by the time the frost-free period arrives, but you're ready to plant your tomato. Well, you can go ahead and plant your tomato because in a couple of weeks, the lettuces are going to be harvested because it'll be hot and they'll be mature, but they haven't competed too much with that tomato. The tomato is still getting established there. It's taking advantage of that center spot in the middle of your pot. So you're kind of growing them just for a few weeks as an overlap or a relay system. But you get a nice lettuce crop and a nice tomato plant off the same container. So that's a really fun thing to do with containers. I think I mentioned this, but planting deep-rooted crops like carrots can be difficult, especially if they're the first ones to come out, and because you end up disturbing the roots a lot. So I don't really recommend those root crops as the first part of the relay here. So don't have them be the thing that needs to come out first. Instead, you might try having them be the second thing. So for example, if you're planting, you have a peppers in a container and then you had some space or extra room around that pepper plant going into the fall, you could plant some carrots around the pepper plant later in the season, let the pepper die in the frost, and then harvest those carrots when they're ready later on. This is a chart that shows the light, water, and nutrient requirements for different vegetables, and it can be used to help you determine what things can be planted together based on these preferences. Again, this will be sent out. All right, we'll talk briefly about these fruit crops. So strawberries are a great plant to grow in containers. So day neutral or ever-bearing strawberries are what I recommend. So these aren't the ones that produce a big crop in June, but instead they'll have a few berries throughout the season. This isn't, what's nice about the day neutral types is they don't have as many runners. So really they just plant the crown and they grow mostly there. They don't send out a whole lot of runners. So they're more suitable for containers that way. You can plant them in fall or spring. If you plant them in spring, you may get a few berries that same year. If you plant in fall, you'll probably start getting berries the next spring. They do need to be outside and have pollinators visit them to produce the fruit. And then in the springtime, or really throughout the season, because if you're growing an ever-bearing type, they may produce flowers throughout the season. The flowers can be frost sensitive, and so you do want to protect them from frost, move them to a warm spot when you're going to have cold nights, especially in the spring. What's awesome about growing strawberries in containers, they can look really pretty. You can have a hanging basket with strawberries and it just looks beautiful. I've seen people do hanging bags with strawberries growing in them. This is a great way to get clean berries. The berries aren't laying on the ground. It's also a great way to protect them from deer. Anyone who's grown strawberries outside may know that deer love strawberry plants. So the other fruit to consider growing containers are blueberries. With these, you really want to select dwarf or compact cultivars. The bushel and berry series has a number to choose from. These are often low bush blueberries or low bush crosses. So they're shorter than some of the blueberries like the rabbit eye types or the high bush types that we often plant in the soil. Blueberries typically need cross-pollination, but to produce fruit, and so they need another variety around to produce fruit. A lot of these are made so that they're self-fertile. They can produce fruit without that cross-pollination, but it's something to pay attention to. If you go to purchase blueberries to plant in containers, make sure you know what the pollination needs are. Make sure your media is appropriate. You don't want to have media that has lime in it. Blueberry is like a lower soil pH, and so just make sure your media is lower in pH or doesn't have added limestone to that media. You want to fertilize these kind of twice annually. So in the spring, when they start to leaf out, and then again after they've fruited, but not later than that. So not later than July usually. Few other tips for success in growing your container plants. Monitor your plants for signs of nutrient deficiency or hunger and fertilize them appropriately. So some nutrient deficiencies show up in leaves You'll see discoloration of leaves, like yellowing on the lower leaves or sometimes the upper leaves. This can often indicate a nutrient issue, and fertilizer may help you. If anytime you have questions about that, I recommend reaching out to your local county extension agent or master gardener volunteer who you may know, or expert gardener, to seek advice on that if that's something that you're new to. If you're growing perennials like your blueberries or your herbs, you want to put those in a new container or refresh the media annually. So generally, kind of going into the new growing season is a good time to do it, or after they've fruited is a good time to do it as well. So those roots get access to fresh media and new nutrients. If you do have a media that's based in nutrients, if the plant is small, and you buy a small blueberry, you can take a couple years to move it into its eventual mature size container, just moving up one size each year. And again, putting in new media to refresh that each time. With these perennials, again, you may want to keep them close to your house for warmth over the winter, or you can also mulch them to help protect the crown over the winter. One thing that containers are susceptible to is drying out during the winter months. So keeping that mulch on them will help keep them moist. Also keep in mind you may need to water them over the winter if it becomes very dry. So there are a few planting calendars out there for anyone to access, and I'm just linking those here. Again, those will go out in the PDF of the presentation. And there's also some excellent resources on container gardening. So the one I have pictured here is the one that has the good information on different mixed plantings that I find really excellent and really helpful. The Extension Gardener Handbook, again, available totally online. And there's a few chapters in there that are going to be helpful for helping you grow in containers. And that's all I have today. So just a few minutes for questions.
All right, thank you so much. Hold on, I'm going back to the questions. And I think, Ellie, I'm gonna have to call on you because I do want to put some lavender in 2 pots that I have here in my office. And I am determined. I have tried it in a pot before. I've tried it in the ground. And this is my 3rd time. So 3rd time is going to be a charm. And I plan to do that. And then I'll take pictures. But you tell me what to do and I'm going to do it. Because I really want it to grow.
Yeah, no, make sure it's well drained. It's one of those that's sort of used to a drier climate than we have here. So don't
Okay.
overwater it. That's key. And make sure
Okay.
the media is well drained. Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the
All right.
winter time, you may mulch it to protect it, just to keep it warm.
Okay. Thank you for that. So
Sure.
like I said, I don't have them in there now, so that helped me a great deal. And don't put anything in the bottom of my pot, right?
That's right. You
Okay.
don't need to. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a question here. It says, when getting this fresh dirt manure mix from a farm, what else needs to be done besides mixing it with this soil that is pre-existing 2 weeks prior to planting?
All right. And let me just make sure I understand correctly. You're getting some kind of manure from a farm?
That's what it's reading. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I generally recommend just sticking with any kind of composted material rather than fresh manure. If you are going to use fresh manure, you want to mix that thoroughly with your soil and don't put it at more than like 10% of the media, because it can really burn plant roots. So I would be very cautious with manure. I'd feel more comfortable putting in some kind of aged manure, if it's been sitting around for a while, or even composted, it's been turned and heated up. I'd be careful with using that kind of product. The other thing is you want to ask the source or the farm that you're getting it from about whether they've used or fed any hay that's been treated with persistent herbicides. I know that sounds a little scary, but there are a number of herbicides that are used in hay and pastures and that are, then fed to cattle and horses. And those can actually persist after the animals have eaten that forage, and then it's come out the other end, and it can be in their manure for years actually. And more and more we're seeing contamination of manure products with these herbicides, and that's just because the herbicides are becoming more common. They're an excellent tool for managing weeds in pastures, so you get good weed-free stuff, but those herbicides are going to be harmful to your plants, pretty much all of your garden plants, especially beans and tomatoes. If you're not sure if it has it and the source that you purchase from isn't sure either, you can always take a sample and mix it with media and try to plant some bean seeds in and see if they grow. So I guess my suggestion is make sure you know that it's a safe manure source. Only put it in at small quantities. I highly recommend getting a compost material over fresh manure. Or if you want to get manure that you know is safe, you could hold it for a while, compost it yourself at home before you mix it in.
All right, and with this same question, it was, do you suggest the soda bottle hats that allow more water to get directly to the root and soil?
I'm guessing that's where you put water in a soda bottle that has holes in it. And if so, that's a great way to water. I think that's really cool. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but yeah,
I'm thinking that that's what they mean, or either, I know I've done it before where I've had the little water bottles and for my, what is it, the window boxes outside, and I'll fill them with water and just pour them up, put them upside down in there and let it drain on its own.
Yep.
And that, I know for my window boxes, that was like life-changing whenever I started doing that, as far as it getting the needed moisture, because it just pulls it out so quickly in that one box that I had. So
yeah, no, that's great. That's a great way to do it.
All right, let's see. And everybody, before you go to, that person was saying yes, great, thank you. Yes, I didn't see that because I was still on another one. I'm sorry. But no problem. What you were saying, Ellie, that's exactly what she was asking. Okay. And then I just have if everybody can make sure that they look in the chat box so that they can complete the survey for today, and knowing that they will receive their training certificate once that's completed. And if there are more questions, please feel free at this moment. We're at the top of the hour. You can unmute yourself real quick, or you can type something in. Okay. So if not, I want to thank you, Ellie, as always. And always to everybody, reminder that Ellie is going to send us the information so we can make sure you get all of this evening. Because again, myself, I'm still in that learning phase. And I told you, I'm trying to have 2 pots full of lavender at my front door this year. So I'm going to journal that so you guys can kind of see it. And I'm going to be doing what Ellie taught me. So I hope you guys share your pictures. And remember, we will start back next month with a 2-part series on local food purchasing. So please go to Eventbrite. That was also in the chat, and you can register for that as well. But once you get that link from Eventbrite, please put it inside your calendars, because that will have your Zoom link on it. So therefore you don't have to look for it each week. So if all hearts and minds are clear, I want to thank you all for joining us as always. I hope this was very beneficial for you as it was for me. Ellie, thank you. We love you. And everybody, enjoy your spring break weekend that's coming up, and have a wonderful Easter.
Thank you, Sharonda. Hope you have a wonderful Easter too.
Thank you.